Jennifer Phegley is a professor and associate chair of English in the English department at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. She holds a Bachelor's of Art in both English and History from Texas State University, an MA and PhD in English from the Ohio State University. She specializes in Victorian periodicals, authorship, reading, and publishing in the 19th century, transatlantic studies, sensation fiction, and pedagogy. Thank you. Dr. Phegley has both authored and edited many published works such as Courtship and Marriage in Victorian England, Educating the Proper Woman Reader, Victorian Family Literary Magazines and the Cultural Health of the Nation, Transatlantic Sensations, Teaching 19th Century Fiction and Reading Women, Literary Figures, and Cultural Icons from the Victorian Age to the Present.
Dr. Phegley found her passion for print culture and Victorian periodicals in graduate school, but felt pushed in that direction by previous experiences in her undergraduate studies. In graduate school, Dr. Phegley studied Victorian literature, where she realized not only that the real explosion of printed materials took place with the publication of magazines for the mass market in the 1850s and 60s, but also that most of the literature of the day appeared in those periodicals. This led to her fascination with reading, writing, and publishing of popular magazines like Young Englishwoman, which we will be discussing today. Much of the content of Dr. Phegley's presentation entitled Promoting Do-It-Yourself Spirit, Samuel Beeton's Young Englishwoman, will also appear in the edited volume Women, Periodicals, and Print Culture in Britain, 1830s to 1900s, the Victorian period, which comes out this April. This research presented today will also be further expanded in Dr. Phegley's upcoming book, Magazine Mavericks, John Maxwell, Samuel Beeton, and the Development of Niche Market Periodicals in the Mid-19th Century England. Dr. Phegley lives with her husband Byron, who writes songs instead of poetry, and their dog Franklin, who is not interested in either history or literature. Dr. Phegley is a phenomenal scholar, and we are honored to have her here at BYU. We would like to turn the remainder of the time over to her. Dr. Phegley.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I really appreciate it. I'm so excited that you all invited me to give a talk here. It sounds like you have a very exciting and event-filled programming going on, especially this month perhaps, but it sounds like consistently. So I am pleased to be a part of it. Okay, can you all hear me okay? Microphones always freak me out a little bit. All right, I will just dive in. Samuel Beeton, known primarily for publishing the Englishwoman's domestic magazine from 1852 to 1879, and Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household Management in 1861, was a successful publishing entrepreneur who founded a slate of magazines for middle-class women, boys, and girls. His Boys' Own magazine, which was published from 1855 to 1874, and its counterpart, The Young Englishwoman, published from 1861 to 1877, are milestones in Victorian periodical history, as they were among the earliest magazines aimed at target audiences defined not only by age, but also by sex. I already lost my place, and I just got started. All right. So there's a lovely scholar named Christine Maruzzi from Australia who points out through her research that in 1824 there were only about 5 magazines for young people that were published in England, but by 1900 there were over 160. However, most children's magazines were short-lived, with runs of a year or less, while just a handful lasted multiple years. Earlier in the century, youth periodicals tended to have a religious bent and were often aimed at both boys and girls. But as the century progressed, gendered reading became more strictly demarcated. Beeton was an early adopter of niche marketing to boys and girls, and the long-lived success of his Boys' Own magazine bolstered his theory that more narrowly defined audiences were viable targets for new periodicals. Previously to the 1850s, it was pretty much believed that the wider your audience, the more successful your publication could be. But in this period, we began to see with mass market publishing a lot more specific and narrow audiences, and that's the phenomenon that I'm talking about today with this periodical. Beeton's savvy ability to imagine new audiences and craft ingenious strategies to engage them helped him build a network of Beeton readers that supported his expanding periodical empire. The Young Englishwoman, first published in December 1864, was a particularly risky venture, despite Edward Harrison's launch of the Young Ladies' Journal earlier that same year. According to Catherine Hughes, conventional wisdom suggested that there was no point in producing a magazine directed at teenage girls, since in this period they moved from childhood to adulthood without inhabiting any transitional stage, supposedly. While Beeton had triumphantly shown that male adolescents were hungry for a literature of their own, it was far from clear that he could pull off the same trick with their sisters. Although the Young Englishwoman's fashion plates and usable patterns for clothing, accessories, and home handicrafts were expensive to produce, these features paid off by attracting readers. Beeton's early success, building a formidable publishing business with a cadre of trailblazing magazines, was due in large part to his savvy partnerships with the clever women who helped him reach his new audiences. His collaboration with his wife Isabella on the Englishwoman's domestic magazine, The Queen, and the Book of Household Management were so crucial to his success that Margaret Beetham maintains that the name Beeton itself represented the working partnership of this companionate marriage. Beeton magazines continued to be collaborative enterprises when Sam joined forces with Matilda Brown, who took over Isabella's duties and made a name for herself as Silkworm in the advice column called Spinnings, launched in Englishwoman's domestic magazine in 1867. Matilda Brown later took the pen name Mira in The Young Englishwoman and continued to use both monikers when she and Sam founded Mira's Journal of Dress and Fashion in 1875. Both Isabella and Matilda helped shape The Young Englishwoman's lighthearted and entertaining approach to cultivating its audience. The magazine was geared towards training proper domestic managers, but it conveyed a more progressive view of the teenage girl than one might expect, teaching self-reliance and what I'm calling here a do-it-yourself spirit. Since the advent of the late 18th century, women's magazines had been largely elite fashion and society publications that ignored the practical concerns of everyday housewives. In contrast, Beeton marketed the Englishwoman's domestic magazine to lower and middle-class women by discussing subjects such as home handicrafts, cooking, gardening. The magazine rejected the model offered by the earlier highbrow publications such as La Belle Assemblée, which ran from 1806 to 1832 and then had multiple carnations after that. These were more luxury commodities with exquisitely colored fashion plates, and they were much more expensive. Beeton's magazines, instead, were notable for addressing women rather than ladies, and they sold at cheaper prices and sought to reach an untapped audience of working housewives. The debut of The Young Englishwoman was one of the brighter moments in the sad months to come when Isabella Beeton would die unexpectedly in February 1865 at the age of 28 after giving birth to her second surviving son. She had several who did not survive. Following Isabella's death, Sam turned to his neighbor, who I've already mentioned, Matilda Brown, for assistance with his publications as well as with his orphaned sons. Their partnership proved fruitful despite the tragedy and upheaval, and The Young Englishwoman became one of Beeton's most successful titles, lasting until the end of the century. However, The Young Englishwoman has been overlooked by scholars as well as biographers. The magazine is mentioned only 18 times across 4 Beeton biographies. This neglect is partly due to Isabella's death just a few months into what was her pet project, necessarily limiting any exploration of how she shaped the magazine's contents. The sole surviving letter between Sam and Isabella during their marriage indicates that she played a significant role in the conception and production of the magazine. In October of 1864, Sam writes to her while on a trip to sell a horse. Perhaps he was selling this horse to obtain funds for the new magazine, in fact. He asks her to send the publisher, quote, a description of the 8 pages you have already got up for the magazine as soon as possible, along with the 2 sets of diagrams and needlework patterns, which he claims will set us right for 6 weeks from now. This suggests that Isabel not only determined the format and features of the early issues of the magazine, but also solicited or wrote much of its contents. However, there's no other direct evidence about what work each of them did on the magazine. So this is a negative side effect of living together and working together. There's no record of what you actually did. Another factor contributing to the dearth of information about the contents of the Young Englishwoman may be the inaccessibility of the periodical today. Although I just discovered that you all have it in your special collections, but as is the case in most libraries that own it, you're missing about the first 3 to 4 years. So the very beginnings of the magazine are extremely difficult to find. And I purchased my copies on eBay, and I thought about bringing one of the volumes, but it's like this tall and this wide and this thick. So I did not do that. But the ones that you'll find in your library are a smaller size. So in 1867, they changed the format, and it becomes more compact. And that's the one that you have that you might want to go take a look at some point. So I get the sense that most of the biographers of the Beetons never actually looked at the magazine itself. The assumption is that it had a strong didactic purpose and few compelling features other than the fashion plates, which were not colored, and the needlework patterns. Biographer Sarah Freeman rather brutally refers to it as the least interesting of the Beeton periodicals, arguing that its immediate success was just attributable to its innocuous character and to the Beeton name on the cover. In contrast to this simplistic account of the magazine, the Beetons overly eschewed a purely moralistic or instructive aim in its very first issue. They called the Young Englishwoman, quote, essentially a magazine of fiction and entertaining literature. But beyond the casual information that may be gleaned from its pages and the interests which we hope may be derived from its perusal, we do not seek to make it in any respect an education journal, replete with information on all of the ologies. Indeed, the editor unequivocally rejects a reader's request in a letter that was written in the second edition of the magazine, stating, "We are sorry we cannot oblige your request for more rules of etiquette in place of fashion plates, as it would draw upon ourselves the just displeasure of our readers if we presume to insert sundry dreary injunctions forbidding them to pick their teeth with a fork." Yet, the magazine's emphasis on needlework, sewing, and other crafts set it apart from the previous elite fashion journals, as it encouraged a kind of maker's culture for those who could not yet afford to buy the goods that they desired. The Young Englishwoman featured all manner of clothing and accessory illustrations and instructions, including slippers, knitted caps, satin bonnets, men's collars in a variety of styles, with all kinds of interesting names such as the Oxford, the Mexican, and the Albert. There we go. As you can see, unlike some of the more elite women's fashion magazines, the plates are more intended to be instructional so that you can copy the designs instead of fashion plates that you would hope to purchase those fashions at your local shops. So most of the illustrations then are sort of either clothing or household products that the readers would emulate or try to produce on their own. The Young Englishwoman imagined its readers as competent and reasoning subjects who could make their own clothes as well as their own decisions about a range of issues, from the mundane, planning meals, managing budgets, overseeing servants, to the lofty, including developing opinions on the education and professionalization of women. Readers of the Young Englishwoman would become professional housewives who treated their wifely tasks as jobs to be done with knowledge, competence, and precision. But they would likewise be independent thinkers. While the Young Englishwoman promoted traditional domestic ideals, it also built on Isabella Beeton's gender-bending premise in the Book of Household Management that the matriarch is, quote, a commander of an army or a leader of any enterprise. So she uses this idea of a commander as a metaphor for what women do in the home. What many have missed is that the magazine embraced women's education and work, even while focusing largely on domestic activities. As Margaret Beeton puts it, Beeton imagined womanhood as a skilled task in a modern world, which increasingly stressed literacy and print-based knowledge as the key to creating a space within the feminine for the masculine qualities of strong-mindedness and organizational competence. G.A. Sala's depiction of the American girl in an article in the Young Englishwoman called The Yankee Young Lady, published in the magazine's first issue, exemplifies the rebellious side of the young Englishwoman. Sala touts American young women's stunning conversational skills and ability to absorb noteworthy facts, lamenting that our English girls have certainly much to learn. They are behind the age. It's a reproach to civilization, progress, and women's elevated mission to see them poring over samplers like so many schoolgirls. Sala and the young Englishwoman certainly promote sewing and embroidering and all of these other important household tasks, but they also endorse the view that there are more interesting options for women that might be demonstrated by the model of the American girl, who never stammers or hesitates and was probably up much earlier than you this morning to read the New York Herald while you were still dreaming. Sala is particularly impressed with the range of subjects upon which American women are able to converse. He notes that they can hold forth on anything from the Monroe Doctrine to the abolition of slavery, from the origin of species to the last novel and the next comet. She has something smart and sparkling and valuable to say at all times. The young ladies of America are a tribute to that country and among the most accomplished talkers in the world, Sala notes. In contrast, now there might be a little bit of a backhanded compliment there about how they talk too much. But in any case, he's still setting this up as a model for English girls to learn a little bit and expand their conversational skills. In contrast to these informed young women, Sala thinks English girls have an embarrassingly lackluster conversational attitude. And in urging a remedy for this, the young English woman notably promotes a plucky drawing room persona, but also endorses wider educational and professional opportunities for women. Indeed, there's a particular essay called What Women Say About Men, which debunks the notion that men are anxious to keep women from taking a share in any work of more general importance and utility than stocking darning or pudding making, and that the anxiety on their part is proof of the slow progress of society towards true civilization. The writer of this article claims that men are actually more open to working women than they are giving credit for, and that there are few trades in which women, if they have capital, may not engage in as freely as men, and provided they have industry, prudence, and good sense, with nearly as equal a chance of success. The essayist argues that most men do not want to associate with silly or ignorant women, and actually prefer those who are clever or learned. Ultimately, the author concludes, women must stop worrying so much about what men think of them and take action to change social assumptions or even establish such things as their own colleges or professional schools. Though the young Englishwoman outlines some surprising paths for women, the majority of readers would likely marry, and the magazine aimed to prepare those women for the process of finding an appropriate spouse and setting up a functional household. Teaching uninitiated young women how best to fulfill their domestic duties was certainly a central component of the young Englishwoman. The magazine suggested that a modern wife must understand how to manage a household budget while feeding the family well and entertaining the occasional guest. Just as important was the creation of a pleasant home environment in which the family could spend its leisure hours. While motherhood was a key part of domesticity, there was very little discussion of child rearing in the magazine. Instead, the focus was on selecting a husband, improving one's cooking and household management, and maintaining a strong marital bond. On the cusp of adulthood, young women were first expected to choose an appropriate husband or to resign themselves to spinsterhood, which was certainly presented as an option, if not the most desirable one. Finding a spouse was no easy task in an era in which young, middle-class ladies and gentlemen were not able to spend much time together unchaperoned. Nevertheless, the Young Englishwoman, like many other magazines and advice manuals of the period, downplayed the importance of parental guidance and endowed the future wife with the responsibility of making her own decision about whether and whom to marry. For example, in the essay Forbidden Bands, the author rejects the obstruction of marital unions by parents or other family members and denounces the clergyman's public call for verbal objections during a wedding ceremony. Noting that marriage is, quote, a civil contract for the mutual benefits of the parties making it, the essayist argues that parents and friends have not the smallest right to forbid or endeavor to prevent a young person from marrying. Addressing a mother who might want to prevent her daughter from marrying a particular suitor, the author quips that it is quite absurd, my dear madam, for you to urge that your proposed son-in-law is ill-tempered, ugly, old, of low birth, stingy, a muff, or a blockhead. All reasons good why you should not marry him yourself. She alone can decide what faults and peculiarities may make her future partner repulsive to her. She only will be accountable for the consequences of her action. So in this case, mothers are told to back off and daughters to step up and make well-reasoned decisions of their own. The magazine likewise guides young women to evaluate potential husbands based on love rather than money, in articles such as, "Shall I Accept Him?" Here, the focus is on what to do after finding a love match that does not bring vast wealth. Readers are informed that 250 to 300 pounds a year is a fine income if one exercises the proper economy and management. And in reality, this would have been a very generous budget for many of the magazine's readers. The Beetons themselves were most likely living on around 400 pounds a year. And even so, Isabella's parents were anxious about their daughter's future, given the volatility of the publishing industry and Sam's propensity for taking risks. He was a little bit of a wild one, a wild card, let's put it that way. Perhaps building on Isabella's more optimistic view of her own marital fate, the young Englishwoman advises that if a wife learns to effectively communicate and collaborate with her husband about the family budget, she will be more likely to succeed. She must, quote, keep accounts not for the week or the month, but continuously and in a business-like and systematic manner. Likewise, she should go to market herself in order to know what the prices are and to learn to, quote, reject the ill-shaped and extravagant joints of meat and keep track of the best deals through a regular accounting of expenditures. It is even possible, the magazine argues, to find a very smug and convenient little house. Sorry, snug, not smug. We don't want smug houses. A snug and convenient little house for 45 pounds a year, along with one general servant for 10 to 12 pounds and a dress suitable for entertaining for 50 pounds. So we have the magazine laying out prescriptive budgets here. As Isabella learned to economize, so would the magazine's readers, who were encouraged to carefully plan their meals according to their own circumstances. The recurring column, Our Drawing Room, offered advice about how to create a luxurious menu on a frugal budget, something Isabella must have had experience with given the domestic role that she played as the eldest daughter of a very large family in her somewhat constrained financial reality upon marriage. Andrea Broomfield explains that Isabella's recipes took into account women's need for dishes that fit their time constraints, their limited number of servants, and their small kitchens, relying on a wider availability of processed foods in urban areas. Recipes in The Young Englishwoman also accounted for the cost of preparing the meal. The magazine pronounced that few would be disposed to deny that it is a genuine pleasure to give any man, rich or poor, high or low, a really good dinner. Indeed, this maxim was applicable to all readers of the magazine, whether they were struggling to serve their own husbands or to serve those less fortunate. Quote, surely the next best thing to giving a man, especially a poor man, a good dinner, is to be able to put him in the way of getting a plentiful meal of sound, wholesome meat for himself and his family at a moderate cost. So one practical answer to dining well on a budget was actually imported ox meat from Montevideo. This was selling in England apparently for 3 pence per pound, and readers were directed to go to Messrs. James Gordon and Company in Liverpool to find it. And they were told that it was accompanied by sheets and instructions for how to dress this unusual beef. The Young Englishwoman announces that it will reprint these guidelines so that readers can promote its sale among the poor, to teach those that they know how to buy it and how to cook it to advantage. Now, this may well have been a ploy or a commercial tie-in, which Beeton was very well known for doing. He was probably the first person to have product placement in his magazines. But it also may have been a veiled way to instruct the magazine's lower middle class readers in the art of stretching their own incomes. So it was giving direct advice surreptitiously by saying this was for poorer people than yourselves, so you should carry this information out, when in fact they would probably, many of them would likely take that advice at home if they really wanted ox meat and to try it out. I don't know. To further this economizing agenda, the Hints on Household Management section of the magazine offered suggestions for affordable meals as well as entire weekly menus intended to keep costs at a minimum. And waste, as you'll see. There's no wasting of food going on in Victorian middle and lower middle class homes. A typical meal would provide roast beef on Monday that was revived on Tuesday as hash beef and broiled bones, or one might serve a roasted leg of pork with applesauce and vegetables fixed up the following day as cold pork and mashed potatoes. And you can see some accountings of the joint of meat carrying on for 4 or 5 days, which gets a little iffy in terms of their refrigeration abilities, which were very limited. The section of the magazine on recipes for seasonal dishes listed the required ingredients first with a single paragraph of directions to follow. This was, according to Andrea Broomfield, an innovation. So the way that we expect recipes to appear to us today, Isabella Beeton was one of the innovators in making those standardized. So estimated cooking times, costs, and guidelines for selecting seasonable fruits and vegetables were all included at the end, but at the beginning you would definitely have your ingredients listed. And apparently Isabella did not know how to cook, and so she found looking through cookery books to be very frustrating because she couldn't figure out the proper ingredients. So when she created her own books, she followed this plan. Of course, not all women would be solely responsible for preparing their family's meals. In many cases, servants would play a role. Despite being referred to as the greatest plagues in life, if treated appropriately, servants could also be the household saviors. As the magazine explains, the country furnishes us with a great many girls fit for service who have received a decent education and are honest and hardworking. So it was up to these young mistresses to turn them into, quote, treasures by training them properly in their duties and doing so gradually and kindly. In fact, good servants are said to be so hard to find precisely because, quote, when they have once found a comfortable home directed by a sensible woman, they take care to stop where they are. Readers are thus encouraged to pay servants fair wages, treat them with respect, and avoid overindulging them. The young Englishwoman places responsibility squarely on the woman of the house, then, to select, train, and nurture their entire staff. In addition to these managerial operations, the magazine encourages artistic expression and pleasure through home handicrafts and decor. In fact, the visual images in the pages of the young Englishwoman become a kind of Victorian Pinterest board, as each weekly issue collected a range of projects intended to adorn the parlor. We can see more of these here. And women could just choose from the various images in each issue, which would include at least 4 of 10 full pages of the issue of the magazine with various illustrations on it. Today, women browse Pinterest to find images and instructions for do-it-yourself projects to save in a visual scrapbook that strikingly melds the Victorian era with the internet age. If you want to plant a butterfly garden, paint your stair risers to look like book spines or piano keys, create silhouettes of your children to hang on the wall, or faux finish a kitchen countertop to look like marble, you can find out how on Pinterest. One can imagine a Victorian lady doing similar projects clipped from the pages of the young Englishwoman. Within what we may consider an incredibly cluttered Victorian home, historian Thad Logan sees a new kind of cabinet of curiosities inherited from the prestigious masculine collections of exotic objects prevalent in the previous century. In taking on the role of curator of the Victorian home, using objects found nearby rather than gathered from exotic locales, women elevated household work to an art with a practical purpose. According to Talia Schaefer, a central idea behind Victorian handicrafts was that craftswomen improved on nature by preserving, arranging, and fixing the materials that nature had left in chaos. Much like the other aims of the young Englishwoman, handicrafts gave women license to creatively assemble their homes using their own imagination and skills. Victorian women thus crafted their way to authority, recycling scraps of fabric, seeds, leaves, feathers, and a variety of animal parts into home decor. In fact, taxidermy was a popular pastime among Victorian women, strangely. Following this trend, the young Englishwoman includes patterns for items such as Berlin work ottoman cushions, a crocheted bread basket cover. There's the butterfly lampshade, and the bizarre ottoman cushion that's also a shawl. I don't know. That one confuses me. There's also a 2-page spread devoted to the tea cozy, and we can also see some gentlemen's collars here. The tea cozy really captured my attention because I started reading the instruction for it, and of course I'm no expert at sewing, but it was very complicated, and it kind of freaked me out. Because of the fact that it had so many steps. So this very popular design is rendered in black cloth cut with pinking shears, onto which a pine leaf pattern in scarlet cloth is sewn with gold thread. From there, the directions become more complicated, incorporating multiple stitching techniques, 3 shades of green, 2 shades of scarlet silk thread, red worsted cord braided and formed into tassels, and alternating layers of red and black cloth arranged in tiers that create the effect of a flounced skirt. For such a simple object, the process is quite precise and onerous, leaving little room for improvisation. As with Pinterest, many of the featured projects seem somewhat aspirational. Whether they inspired new decorating ideas or simply overwhelmed and discouraged readers is hard to tell. In any case, they certainly caused a crafting craze that reached its peak at mid-century. However, as handicrafts became more pervasive, they also became less desirable. Complicated designs for beaded work bags or gentlemen's slippers or traveling caps were probably more fun to imagine than to make and use. As Schaefer puts it, craft itself became a kind of taxidermy, a stuffed relic of what had once been alive. The current revival of craft culture on Pinterest notwithstanding, by the end of the 19th century, such endeavors came to symbolize a traditional model of womanhood that became outmoded. The very objects used in handicrafts often seemed absurd, as the young Englishwoman noted in an article called Costume versus Congruity. Incorporating rotting flowers or dead insects into hats or jewelry was, quote, ludicrously unstable and out of place, while making a headdress with, quote, several varieties of fruit in season and out, enough to furnish a dessert for half a dozen people, is an outrage both upon common sense and taste. Encountering a young lady exhibiting a whole sheaf of oats in the front of her hat, so fragile as to break with every rustle and bestrew her path, she deserved the remark made by a witty gentleman that she was, quote, merely sowing her wild oats. Whether sowing oats onto hats or metaphorically sowing wild oats, readers had an abundance of home handicrafts and self and home improvement advice to choose from in the pages of The Young Englishwoman. While the popularity of handicrafts receded, the do-it-yourself spirit of the magazine prevailed in its insistence that young readers rely on their own intelligence, ingenuity, and work ethic to succeed. Sam Beeton's innovative collaborations with his wife Isabella and his neighbor Matilda Brown resulted in one of the first and most important magazines for young women. As the precursor to 20th century and 21st century teen magazines such as 17, Young Miss, Sassy, and the currently surprisingly political Teen Vogue, The young Englishwoman offered training for traditional domestic roles while also encouraging independent thinking among a newly defined group of readers. Beeton's launch of his magazine for young girls thus sparked a publishing revolution that made girls a viable and profitable audience for centuries to come. Thank you.
Dr. Jennifer Phegley just shared with us a small snapshot into the lives of young adult 19th century women. Through her research, she opens a brief window into England's homes, more specifically, a window into the lives of the women who ran them. As with all explorers of the past, she asked those who came before, who were you and how did you live? Dr. Phegley's historical analysis gave us a chance to see what Englishwomen of the time felt and thought. Although we may not have primary sources of the young women themselves, the Young Englishwoman periodical gives an insight into the cultural expectations and society-wide thinking of its writers and thinkers. Writers and readers. Whew. I know, right? Whether you believe the magazine influenced the cultural change or social advancement inspired the magazine, women of this time were motivated by the call to become more than just domestic workers, but engineers and artists in their homes. Yes, Samuel Beeton's critics do question the audacity of the young Englishwoman, but so has every opposing voice to progression and change throughout history. The young Englishwoman's success proved the well-received response of the masses. As influential beings, we are changed by what we use to entertain ourselves. Dr. Phegley's lecture touches on the role media has in planting ideas in the minds of consumers. In today's American culture, we see examples of magazines eliciting gossip, envy, and conflict in every checkout line. Have we as consumers become complacent? Are we fighting against these negative influences? And are we setting the bar higher for our entertainment? Like the readers of the Young Englishwoman, girls and young women today are eager to become more. They are hungry for growth. Just like 19th century young women, they respond to the call to become thinkers, builders, and innovators. Are we helping them meet their potential? We have the opportunity to facilitate the flourishing of our daughters, sisters, and friends. And in this way, the historical question, how did you live, is answered with this, not too differently than you. We will now have Montana Jolly lead our Q&A session.
Okay, so is this on? Okay. So I'll begin the Q&A with the first question for Dr. Phegley, and then if anyone else has questions, if you'll just come line up here behind the mic, and she'll take as many questions as we have time for. So Dr. Phegley, you talked a lot about the objectives and the goals of the Young Englishwoman and how it impacted its readers. And I'm wondering what you think the objectives of magazines directed towards young women are today and how those objectives are impacting its readers.
That's a really good question. Thank you. I don't think I'm sorry, Jeremy just said, he just made the point that it's not that different from today. So I think when I come to these magazines, what I'm always struck by is how contemporary they feel in some ways. I mean, definitely there are a lot of entrapments of the period, which all those illustrations that I showed you, I think really drive home. We don't even really know what all those objects are for, or why would you make that? I don't know. But really, I think that a lot of the messages are the same. And so I think that's what surprised me most about the Young Englishwoman was that there's very little scholarship on the magazine, and based on the biographical information and the cursory examinations of the magazine, I was expecting it to be a lot more Victorian in terms of being prescriptive about women's behavior, in terms of having even more restricted views about what happens in the household, having women more as objects for their husband to take pleasure in or to show off to friends and colleagues. And what I found was a place where women could have agency within the confines of their domestic roles that they were mostly expected to have. But even more surprising, some advice and references to ways women could have roles that were not confined by marriage and that were outside the home. So it seems to me that as we've moved along through the centuries, we get more and more further and further away from the idea that women must marry. But at the same time, it is still our societal expectation. And so many of the young girls and even women's magazines are still very geared towards how you're going to find a husband. So I think that the commonalities strike me, but also the ways in which these magazines, even for young girls, particularly this one, breaks molds or breaks expectations or assumptions about what people think they should be. Granted, Beeton himself was as I said, he was a wild card. He was a very unconventional, bohemian kind of guy. And is anyone familiar with the PBS series, The Short Life and Long Times of Mrs. Beeton? It's fantastic. You got to see it. I think most of it's on YouTube. But it's based on Catherine Hughes's biography, which is the most recent biography of the Beetons. And I find it interesting that all the biographies are about the couple, not one or the other. But in it, Catherine Hughes, who received exclusive access to family information because she went and knocked on people's doors, and unfortunately, she's not being a very generous scholar in the fact that she's keeping all that information to herself and not sharing it with anyone. I know, it's kind of annoying. But in any case, she speculates that the reason Isabella Beeton died is because she contracted syphilis from her husband, Sam, who was notoriously visiting prostitutes before his marriage. So that's and that likely is why they had so many children die in childbirth, and then why Isabel died at 28. Now, there's no definitive proof of that, but it seems pretty well laid out. And if you either read that biography or watch that film, it does kind of give you a lot of background details on that, and that's interesting. So here we have a man. Now, I know this is a really long answer, but we have a man who is unconventional in a lot of ways himself, and who broke boundaries, but who also had a high regard for women's abilities and saw Isabella and then later Matilda as a true partner, a co-equal partner. And so I think that's what's so interesting about him. So therefore, he would be likely to be producing periodicals that were a little bit irreverent and rebellious, and he did. So.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we're out of time for more questions, but Dr. Phegley will be here to answer some after if any of you would like to come chat with her for a moment. But special thanks to everyone who participated today, and especially to Dr. Phegley. If we can just give her one last round of applause.
Thank you so much.